This week's episode of the Unbuild It podcast is brought to you by Huber Engineered Woods and their Home Building Crossroads webinar series. They'd like you to join Pete and Steve for an in-depth look at building science of foundations. The Home Building Crossroads is an education series dedicated to better building science education. Our new foundation webinar covers all climate zones and all types of foundations. Foundations are certainly a critical part of our home. We build everything else on top of them. And Steve and I are taking a unique cut to look at the performance of all types of foundation systems in all climates. There are two opportunities to participate in the webinars, one on April 20th and one on April 22nd. You can register for free for any of these webinars in the Home Building Crossroads series at homebuildingcrossroads.com.
Let's talk construction management software and what makes a software good. First, I'd say the ability to tackle the tasks that I need it to do, but more importantly, the ability for my team to comprehend the software, my clients to comprehend the software, and everybody involved to actually want to use that software or that interface. BuildBook could be that software for you. BuildBook is simple to learn and use. It allows for constant communication between you, your team members, and your clients. It doesn't waste time with unneeded features, and you won't have to send your team across country to learn how to operate it efficiently. At the end of the day, BuildBook should reduce your stress and your team's stress as well. BuildBook is an all-in-one construction software for today's builders. Whether you're a one-person operation or a large building crew, BuildBook has plans to fit your budget. They don't have any of those nagging sales calls or tricky upsells or hidden fees. You can sign up for a 10-day free trial with BuildBook so that they can teach you and show you what the value is of their product. You should head over to buildbook.co to get started. Don't forget to mention that you heard it from us, the Unbuild It podcast. That's buildbook.co. Thank you, BuildBook, for your sponsorship.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Unbuild It podcast. I'm your lead host this week, Pete Yost. I've got Steve Basic.
Hey, everybody.
And Jake Bruton. And we're
Hello.
ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, we are.
I want to start off by saying that this is Windows 101, our initial thoughts. And we oftentimes start off with something from one of our key mentors, Joe Stiebrick from Building Science Corporation. And I distinctly remember an early presentation of Joe's that I went to when I was first working for Building Science Corporation. And Joe, at the very beginning of this building science training, said, well, if we could just keep people and windows out of buildings, they would perform exactly the way we wanted them to. And I thought, yeah, this is the Joe Stiebrick I heard about. He's legendary.
Which is actually, Pete, that's kind of the way that I always talk about business. If it wasn't for employees and clients, I would have the best job in the world.
We'd have a world of like communication transfer buildings, right? You know how you drive through some towns and you say, yeah, that's a CIA building. It's just the Verizon sign's just a cover up, right? It's a front. But there's something happening in that building.
Big server buildings, that type of thing. Okay, so we're not going to talk about technologies this time around. We're not going to talk about NFRC labels or the technical side of Windows. This is all about how we think about them at the start of different projects. And I think it's really cool because I don't buy a single window in my business. I give guidance on technical performance of buildings. I don't actually purchase or bid anything. And we have a high-performance builder in Jake and high-performance architect in Steve, and they have very unique perspectives on how they think about glazing and windows. So I'm going to start it off by setting Steve up because he's got this really cool diagram that he uses to explain how he thinks about glazings and windows at the start of a project. So take it over, Steve.
Yeah, so that image that you talk about, it's basically 4 gears, and I talk about the 4 simple components of energy efficiency or building, however you want to label it. But it's basically windows, HVAC equipment, insulation, and air sealing. And those are the 4 main components of you could say getting it right. Now, what's interesting to me about those 4 is in most houses, windows are the ones that are most likely never to be replaced or to be the headache of replacement, right? And I can say that very stoutly because in the last 30 years, renovating tons of houses here in New England, guess what one of the big questions is in every one of those projects?
Should we replace the windows?
Are we taking? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we taking?
Are we
guesses?
going to replace the windows?
Yeah.
Right.
Peter, you
Because-
got to wait for him to call on you next time.
Yeah. You put your hand up, gentlemen, please. I like to run in some type of orderly fashion here. I know you guys are just riffraff and want to just speak out of turn, but,
Oh boy.
but anyways, it's always the question, and it's always that question of, are we going to replace them? They're the big, one of the big ticket items because you end up with a project that say has a $200,000 budget and you're at $198,000, and now you're saying, okay, are we going to replace the windows? And then replacing the windows are another 40 grand or 35 grand.
Yeah.
Right. So now the homeowner sits there in hems and haws. They have a house that already has 2 or 3 different styles of windows and generations of windows. And it just becomes one of those things. And I think it's part of it is the price, but the other one is it's the way they get installed. They're embedded into the assemblies usually, right? Because we don't really think about how we would replace them if we're gonna. And so they become this big challenge later on. And then that challenge, I've learned to incorporate that in new construction thinking. And guess what I tell clients? Well, what about windows? And keep in mind that these are probably the things that are going to be the last thing to be replaced or modified in the house.
So,
But how
Steve,
do we go from there?
Those gears, those dials, another key part of that I think is really cool is that what you're saying is if I spin one dial because they're gears, it connects to how I change the other 3. So
it definitely connects, but if I improve too, so let's just take those 4. If I go into I buy an old house and then I go in there and I say, okay, I'm going to replace the furnace. I'm going to go up in the attic, add some insulation, and I'm going to run around the attic with a can of expanding foam and tighten up the house. So I do all 3 of those things. And at the beginning, let's just say everything is 25% of the problem, right? All 4 components. Mm-hmm. Well, if I go and I upgrade those 3 to 15%, now my windows are half the problem.
Right.
Steve, let's back up. Give me the 4 items on the gears again. I think we talked about it in our pre-meeting, but I don't know if you said it this time.
HVAC and equipment.
Yep.
Insulation, air tightness, and windows.
Okay. Thank you.
They all, performance depends on all 4 of them.
So, Steve, when you first get a project and you're sitting down to do initial design, do windows come up key that early in the design?
Yes. And the reason windows come up, and it might not necessarily be a performance standard that's driving it, but the first thing any client wants to do when they walk the site is, hey, look at that view.
Yeah.
Right. And then the minute I stand, and this just happened last Saturday, Lexi and I were out at 2 projects and we were visiting 2 sites for 2 new projects. And we got hey, look at that view. And 2 things happened. One, I looked and I appreciated the view. The second was I looked to see where the sun was because it was noontime.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to understand both what the solar orientation is of that lot as well as where the views are. And is it working in my favor? Is it partially in my favor? Is it not in my favor?
And so that conversation for the client was something completely different than the conversation in your head, right? Like your perception was 15% the same as what they were talking about, and then 85% other considerations that have to do with your process and the goals of the home from an energy standpoint and comfort.
Yeah, and I think this is an important, and you bring up a really important piece that I can elaborate on. This is where a lot of builders and architects have the tail wagging the dog, right? Because if you go in there and the client says, hey, look at that view, and then you just continually talk about the view and not inject your professional thoughts, then the tail's wagging the dog. But if I go in there in that conversation and say, yeah, that's the view, but down this right side is really where you're going to capture some sun and, you know, that kind of stuff. And we can get some heating and make it, you know, it might not be a passive house, but you can always use that heating from the sun. Get it free while you can. But as professionals, we need to elaborate that conversation to all realms of the pros and cons of that site, not just that beautiful view.
And Steve, so you're thinking two things too, I think, which is the direction the glass will face, but also the percentage of floor area or wall area, right? Because you're trying to maximize daylighting, view, connection to the outdoors, but on the other hand, you want to be pretty strategic about how much glass and what type of window, right?
Yeah, I mean, all of that certainly plays a role, and it's one of those things where I don't know how to explain this. It's like there might be 10 topics that run through my head in that initial conversation. The homeowner says, hey, look at that view. And I have these 10 categories that run through my head, and some of them become kind of subtopics. For instance, you know, I might ask the client, you know, 2 or 3 minutes into the conversation, like, are you a morning person or not? Right? Because you might want your bedroom on the east side, and you might want to get that sunlight in there. Or you could be, you know, the vampire client, and you want the, you know, your bedroom on the northwest corner. And maybe
I feel
the
like
breakfast.
vampire client you have a specific person in mind, and it's slightly insulting when you say that.
I don't have anybody in mind. I'm total generic.
If you have a vampire client, you just don't want any bad blood with that person.
There we go.
Hey,
but so there's all these subcategories that come into play, and some of those questions I might not ask right away, but they're running through my head that says, "Hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. These are things to think about, Steve. These are future questions in the next meeting or two."
And do either of you two, as practicing building professionals, do energy modeling? In other words, do you quantify the impact of the glass in terms of the design?
Yes, but I do it in real time at full scale. So I stand in front of that window after that house is built and think about what impact that window had on the environment.
So it's really interesting because I have done full scale modeling. It just hasn't been energy modeling.
Mm. So you're referring to like
shirts and ties, menswear, activewear, those sorts of things is what he's talking about.
Well, you should have let me go, Jake, because I really was.
He would have been totally down the wrong road, lost in the weeds.
I had no idea what you're talking about. And I got one more quick question in terms of design for both of you. Skylights. What do you think about skylights in terms of design?
I don't like poking another hole in the roof.
That's the builder. There. That's exactly how I was
I also have lived in only one house that had a skylight in it, and it was in the dining room. And lunch was uncomfortable because of that stupid skylight, because it was direct light, 30%, 40% of the year that was uncomfortable. And so I have like personal experience that pushes me to not want to use them. I also, since we started building high performance or better performing homes, have not done a skylight simply because we haven't had a triple glazed skylight conversation with our window distributor.
Interesting. Hey, Steve, what about you from a design perspective?
Yeah, I tell clients, I look at it as an all-encompassing, durability, energy efficiency, comfort, all of that stuff that Jake talked about. And I simply roll it into one comment to the client. And, when they say, hey, what do you think about skylights? I say, I think we are putting a window in the most challenging environment we could pick on the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to believe that we're going to be successful with that decision and execution for a very lengthy time is pretty naive.
When
I will say, kind of not even really a window. When we've done some remodeling projects on older homes in our market, a couple of like enclave rooms where the room doesn't have any windows, it doesn't have any exterior doors. We have used those very cheaply made. I don't mean that in a bad way. Cost-effective sun tunnels. That's just the reflective tunnel that then has a diffuser on the bottom, and insulated the heck out of it on the perimeter. I'm sure they're not good for energy efficiency, but those suckers make, like, we've done it in a couple hallway bathrooms that didn't have a window. It makes it so that I tried to turn the light off when I was leaving the room because it's that bright and nice.
So like a solar tube.
Yes, but
they've come a long way because I used them when they first came out, and then we've recently used them, and they're worlds apart. Worlds apart.
But it brings up a good point about one of the aspects of what we're doing with windows is we are trying to make the environment inviting, and lots of times that means light. It's not just the view, it's the light.
Yeah.
It's funny, guys. We were talking about skylights. I'm sitting up here in my little studio space upstairs, and I obviously have a skylight in my roof here. But one of the things that I did here was I intentionally put it very high. It's literally about 8 inches down from the ridge. So that way it doesn't have that much water north of it. Everything is below it. So that it's in a challenging environment, but I put it in the least challenging part of that environment.
So you put it as high up on the roof as possible so there's less runoff hitting.
Less runoff,
still
less
the same
snow,
amount of rain,
sitting against
just
it.
not roof water.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was going to say when my brothers and I were remodeling full time, dropping skylights into rooms that were that weren't getting a lot of light was incredibly popular, and we loved to do it because as soon as we put the skylight in, we knew that we were going to be back within a month to put in very expensive shading devices, because that's one of the problems with skylights is that, in terms of glare, and we had one client say, yeah, you got to put a shade in because when it's a full moon, we can't get to sleep, because it's so bright inside the room. So, and the shading kits for skylights were pretty expensive. They were lucrative to install. So yeah, my experience with the skylights is there's a lot better places to put a hole in your building than on the roof.
Yeah, so here's a great idea, right? Let's take an R38 roof system, cut a hole in it, put an R3 window in it, and then cover it with basically impermeable light blocking shade and create a microclimate. Right? The only thing worse would be putting it over the shower.
Right, which you certainly get a lot of requests for. Yeah,
which we've seen. Yes.
So that
there's a Stephen Wright joke, a very deadpan comedian. I installed a skylight in my apartment. The people that live above me are pissed.
Yeah. I love that guy.
I can just see Stephen Wright delivering that line. That's good, Jake. Okay, so I got another question for you two from a design perspective. How often do you think about or have a conversation with your clients about the type of window coverings they're interested in as part of a design question? And I thought there would be a long pause.
Yeah. So I haven't had that many conversations with clients about that, about window coverings. I actually would say lately I've had quite a few different clients bring up the idea of exterior shading devices, which I think is fantastic, because if you can stop all that energy from hitting that window and you're trying to keep it from coming in, why not keep it outside the building? But there is not a cost-effective, cost-effective is a relative term, cost-effective way to do exterior shading that is active.
Yeah,
that I've found.
You know what's interesting? I've been to Europe and went to the window show there, and obviously just with dealing with European windows.
It's a weird brag, by the way.
What's that?
That's a weird brag. I've been to Europe and been to the window.
It's a fact. I can show you the airline ticket stub. I've actually been.
Most
there.
people, Steve, when you ask them about their European trip, it doesn't involve windows. But,
yeah, well, this was all
we're
about
right there
windows.
with you.
I went to
Right there with you.
factories and stuff, but the thing that I learned was, if a European buys a window, they pretty much buy the shading device with it. Like it's like it's analogous to us getting a window screen. Like, hey, in that window, I'm going to get a window screen with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah. Well, in Europe, it's you get the window screen and the shading device.
Yeah.
And I toured a number of houses there, and what was really interesting was even we would consider the lesser expensive homes that we visited. We're talking, laminate floors, laminate countertops, etc. Where you walk in and say, hey, it's a nice house, it's a new house, but it's not extravagant. They have triple glazed European windows with exterior solar shading devices.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just their culture views it totally different. In America, we just say, yeah, we'll just throw another ton at the AC.
Yeah. Well, I kind of asked that question because to me, it's really interesting that the very first thing in either a commercial building or a residential building that the occupants do when they get inside it is they immediately buy something to change the performance of the windows, which is fascinating, right? Because you as an architect, Steve, worked really hard to make the performance of the window line up with the performance of the building. But if you're not taking into consideration what they're going to use for a window covering, which can substantially change the performance, that was kind of a missed opportunity.
It even goes further than that, though, Peter. I had a project. We did a new house, probably this is about 5 or 6 years ago now. And they were domestic windows, U value 0.30. But anyways, we turned over the house probably like October. By about February, the builder's getting calls from the wife saying, hey, you guys screwed up. It's in my kids' rooms. The glass is soaking wet every morning. And I'm talking to the builder and I'm like, he's like, what the hell's going on? And I'm like, it can only be there's moisture in the room somehow, right? And it's condensing on the windows. It's the only way we're going to get water on the inside. And so having a conversation with her, it's like, what's your daily routine? What's happening here? Okay, kids sleep in these rooms, right? Yes. Both my girls sleep in each of these bedrooms. Okay. Is there anything you do? Is the front door or the bedroom door open or closed? We close the door every time, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else that you do? I see you have some shades on here, and they had light blocking shades that were like custom fitted to the opening.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the last piece of information that I got out of her was, oh yeah, every night about 2 hours before bedtime, I go up and we start the humidifier. Right. And we let it run all night. The kids, it's just that they sleep so much better.
Right.
And it's like, okay, so you have this, you're at 70% RH in that room with an R3 piece of glass that is behind this shade, creating this microclimate that is basically a thermal blanket. And you're freezing the hell out of that glass, and you have 70% RH in the room with the door closed.
Yeah.
It's like, you got to change your lifestyle. There's not a window that's going to survive that situation.
So the other thing that's interesting to me about this is we said we weren't going to talk technical, and we've only been doing this for maybe 30 minutes, and I have to be technical.
Of course.
Because, it is possible to make an interior window covering that is thermally performing well and fairly airtight, but the moisture goes right through it, right? Which is kind of the worst situation for condensation, right? You're making the interior-most layer, the window covering, really, really energy efficient, which makes the glass super cold, and you're not stopping the moisture. And we know, because water molecules are so much smaller than air molecules, that it's pretty easy to pick a material that would stop most of the air exchange from getting to that cold glass, but not stop the moisture. So, that it's like, and so, that website that I worked on a number of years ago called efficientwindowcoverings.org, it's a key part of how glazing performs, because if you think we have a lot of properties that can be involved in the selection of the glass, think of all the different types of window coverings there are. I mean, there's probably 15 different ones, all with sort of different purposes, but they also can have an impact on the energy or the moisture performance of the building. So, maybe we'll talk more about that later. But
well, what's interesting, Peter, is I'll check that and raise it, because I've been in a house with your brother Nathan that we were doing a building investigation on, and it's not even window coverings. It could be the small portal that the window is, combined with the performance of the window and the location in the house. We were doing a building investigation in this house. It was a brick mass wall that had a wood frame to the interior, but the window wells were probably like 16 inches deep.
Mm-hmm.
And going up the stairs, there was this series of small little windows that were probably like 21 inches wide by 30 inches tall,
mm-hmm.
like slivers. But they were set back like 14 inches in that window well. And it was the winter time. We were walking up, there was literally ice on the inside of those windows because the heat couldn't get in. There was literally this little microclimate being created in these little, for what I would consider cubbies of the windows.
So
and there were no even coverings. The heat was just going right by the openings and not being able to really get in there.
So if you had a thermal camera, you would have gotten a really huge temperature difference between the interior wall and that glazing, which was stuck really, if it was on the outside of that 16 inches, it's basically outside the building.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off, Jake.
No, that's okay. Let's actually, since we're talking about window placement in the wall, I feel like it gets brought up a lot when I'm in conversations with you, Steve, with other people about your idea of placing the window in the middle third of the wall. I think that it almost always gets skipped with the idea that we're talking about big, thick walls. We're not talking about the middle third of a 2x6 wall necessarily. Mm-hmm. We have choices that we can make in the design process and in construction. But when we talk about thick walls, talk to me about this middle third, since we've said microclimate so many times already.
Well, so the example I just gave is a good example of risking putting the window all the way out on the outside. And I'm actually I just had this conversation with a good friend of ours, Travis, because he's working on a house.
Easy
he sent
with
me the
friend word.
What's that?
Acquaintance.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know you guys were that close. But he sent me these drawings of a house that he was bidding, and he was asking my thoughts. We were walking through them, and one of the things was it was this modern house with a double wall assembly, and there were some really deep light window wells. Mm-hmm. And the architect had placed the windows literally flush with the outside of the wall. And I said, that's good if you have a 5 or 6 foot tall window, but if there's anywhere where you have a 24-inch window high, then you might not be getting enough heat out at that window and even if it's a good window. And he didn't know whether they're going to be double glazed or triple glazed at that moment. But that's always in question. When I look at windows in a thick wall, and we'll just use 12 inches because it's an easy math, right? We want to put the window in that middle 4 inches, and anything outside in the first 4 inches, then you risk creating this microclimate inside. And what are they? The isotherm modeling drawings or printouts will show this very effectively. And if you bring the window too far inside, then one of the problems you're going to have is you're going to have a hell of a flashing nightmare, right? Because you're now doing this flashing pan that could be 8-9 inches in depth. And so you put yourself at risk there. So that middle third seems to be, okay, I get a nice flashing pan that's 3 inches or so. The window occupies the middle 4, and I don't create that much of a microclimate. I still get a nice window sill.
So a couple of those, like from the builder takeaways from that conversation, Steve, is number one, I like the idea of my window has a little bit of a roof over it. So moving it to the middle of the wall gives me a little bit, but exactly what you said, if I move it all the way in, that makes my pan be a lot more of a challenge. There's certainly things that you can do there to make it simple. You know, you could do a really good job and it still work moving it all the way in from a water management standpoint.
Well, you effectively double the amount of flashing, right? If I move it from 4 inches to 8 inches, I just, if it's $1,000 in flashing tape, I just made it $2,000 in flashing tape with that one decision.
Yep. And it's a challenge, risk, cost, you're balancing all those things. Even like the windows at my house that are set in the middle third of the wall, and we're flashed on the outside on all 4 sides. We're a face sealed system. I wouldn't do that if I didn't have the carpenters working with me that I have, because that's a challenging thing to get right. I wouldn't recommend that, spec builders start doing that exactly. There's execution that goes along with all these little choices from a building standpoint. But I love the idea that you clarified the middle third thing applies less when your windows are huge, because the bigger the opening, the easier it is for something to get in there or get out. Right. If the window is 10 foot by 10 foot and in a 10-inch deep wall, it's not even going to feel like it's in a 10-inch deep wall. But if it's 2 foot by 2 foot and in a 10-inch deep wall, it's going to feel like a portal or a, what is the term for where they would shoot the arrows on the castle? Just that little slot in the wall, Yep.
So I think
there is a name for that, and I forget what it is. But you brought up a really good school. You brought up a really good point that I love. The detail is moving that window back and having a little bit of a roof on it in that window cavity. It does 2 things. One, it provides a place for outside water to drip. But the other thing that I found, I have a number of details. It allows me to bleed my rain screen at that instance too, because I could put that the head casing on there, and I can hold the head extension jamb or extension head piece, and I can just leave it like an 1/8 inch short and have a little gap in there that drains water out of my rain screen system there. So I get the benefit of both things, because then I'm not moving the water laterally.
Well, and even if you are, you can slope that head and let that head protrude past the siding, and then you're even moving that stuff out further away from the window too.
So in our conversation a minute ago, we were talking about energy modeling, and I just want to go back there quickly, because both of you are saying you don't really quantify the performance of the glass in the initial building. But Steve, if you're doing a passive house project, then there is an energy model that's driving those relationships quantitatively, right?
I guess it's one of those things, Peter. It's like the numbers matter, but they don't matter, right? So we can energy model the window, but what it really comes down to for me is I probably, in 99% of my projects, my choices are between these 3 windows.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And they're price pointed. And it's, these are the European windows, the 2 or 3 manufacturers that I'm going to use. These are the 2 or 3 domestic that I'm going to use. And then these are the 2 or 3 kind of baseline domestic, let's say, least acceptable window.
But Steve, having said that, I remember at Building Science Corporation under the Building America program that you and an engineer, probably Coda, would go back and forth about the performance of things like glass because of the impact it had on the HVAC system. So I just remember a lot of modeling interplay between your design and the performance of the building.
Yeah, I mean that it certainly plays a role. There's two things to talk about there. One, I vaguely remember this conversation, and that makes you feel old when you sit there and say, I can't quite remember the conversation. But I want to say, in talking with one of the other engineers there, whose opinion I hold in highest regard, he was a smart gentleman, but he had said that there's a point where the house becomes so energy efficient where orientation doesn't matter as much. Mm-hmm. And he came across on that because at the time we were working with Artistic Homes in New Mexico, and there, when you buy a piece of land and cut it into 350 lots and you have 5 plans, well, plan 1, the front might be south on A Street, right, but on B Street, the front might be west, mm-hmm, or it might be east. And does that mean we change the windows in that plan? No. We find kind of the middle of the road acceptable design, and then we run with that.
Yeah. So that,
right? When you're doing a custom house, you can play with that a little bit more because I can sit there and say, let's increase this glazing by 10%. And I'll give you an example of that. Dan Roy's house, the passive house down in Falmouth. And I say it only because Dan Roy, a retired engineer, has got every conceivable number known about his house. And he was his own passive house consultant, right? 57% of the heating energy in that house comes through the south-facing windows.
Right.
And about 30% of our wall, and it's his front of the house is due south, perpendicular, perfect south. Mm-hmm. And the challenge there was, how do I get 30% glazing on the front of the house? Because that basically turns your house into a fishbowl, right?
Yeah, like a storefront.
I mean, everybody's going to see what you're doing. So now it plays a role in, well, what are the spaces that face that, mm-hmm, right? Because obviously I don't want to put my bedroom there. So every time I wake up, the neighbors see me walking around my bedroom.
Right.
So you have to put spaces.
Or maybe you do.
Or maybe you do. Yeah, in your case, I hear you. But the other thing too is when you have that much glazing and solar shading, in our case, in that project, was a limited amount, mm-hmm, then you need to put spaces where you're not asking somebody to sit for any duration in front of that window, mm-hmm, right? So maybe it's an office or a dining room, or, somebody goes in there, they sit for an hour, have a quick bite, and then they're up and out of that room. They're not sitting on the couch in front of that window for 4 hours. But I just thought it was, it was very enlightening to me that 57% kind of stuck in my head, that as long as the sun comes up, 57% of Dan's heat load is taken care of, which is pretty amazing. I mean, think of the baseline that you're starting there. I mean, that's a huge argument for passive house right there, right? Yeah. Is 43, I only have to deal with 43% of my heating. That means 57 cents on the dollar is paid for by God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's, I don't know, that number seemed to really stick out to me and make a huge difference. And, that translates into, both of you have always, and I know you guys have heard the question and have responded to it, but, what do you say when people say, do I really need triple glazed windows in this environment or this climate zone? Right? I mean,
do you like being comfortable inside your house?
Yeah. I tell people windows are always the worst part of the wall. It doesn't matter. You could be building an R13 window. An R13 wall, 2x4 with an R13 bat in it. And it's still going to be almost twice as good as the window, the best window alongside it. So you're never going to be able to leverage a window against an insulated wall. All you can do is try to keep up, but you can't keep up.
So we're going to talk about the technical aspects of window and glazing performance in our second episode on windows. But just to do a real quick wrap up on our initial thoughts and sort of from a design perspective, Steve, from both a performance and a aesthetic standpoint, glazing's like really high on your list when you start your initial design for a building.
Well, yeah. I mean, glazing, when think of all the marketing pictures you've ever seen about architecture or houses.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what are they? The money shots are the glass wall lit up, at dusk.
Right. Right.
And it's to emphasize the windows, but it gives you that depth perception of, hey, there's a house back there. It looks really cool, blah, blah, blah. But, like Jake said earlier, that's kind of our eyes to the world. It's if we wanted to build houses like Joe had suggested, we'd all live in a tool shed with a periscope, right?
Right.
Not quite the environment that we want to live in. And, when you get into houses that are on a mountainside or a beach or oceanside or lakeside, it's, that game heightens because people are sitting there and saying, I just paid $800,000 for this piece of property to look out on that lake. I want to look out on that lake. I want to look out on that lake every inch of the back of this house. Whatever room I'm in, I want to see that lake. And that's what clients are tuned to care about. It's our job to cultivate those thoughts, but also enlarge that spectrum so they can understand the ramifications and based on that decision. Because it's not all just about the view.
And when you two are doing remodeling projects, if it's not a gut rehab where, you said at the beginning of this episode, Steve, that because the windows are so built into the structure and hard to remove or change, that, unless you're recladding the outside of the building, how often is the energy performance of the windows, how often do you tell the client, hey, you've got to do this first, as opposed to other aspects of building performance?
Go ahead, Jake.
Well, it's a very challenging equation. We have to have conversations about comfort and energy efficiency. And, even like we have a list of stuff that we talk about and do when we first get to a remodel. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do a blower door test. Even if energy isn't part of the remodel, we're just going to prove that we didn't make things worse. Or we're going to camera the sewer before we do anything. Our rule is anything over $15,000 in the house, we're going to camera your sewer before we do any of that, because I don't want you to waste your money on a bathroom remodel if your sewer line needs to be replaced. So it's a pragmatic approach that we also have to take with windows. That's just a balancing act more than anything.
I mean, two things come to mind, Peter. One, I tell clients, I say, sooner or later, somebody has to pay for bad decisions. Right? So if you live in a 200-year-old house that has 4 additions on it, and they were all pretty frugal,
yeah,
and you live there now, then you got a hell of a bill on your hands.
You've inherited that performance.
And you inherited that, right? But for all the younger architects, builders, and even some of the older ones that might not know how to have the conversation, I think one of the most important things is knowledge is key. You can't go and have that discussion with homeowners unless you have the knowledge backup, right? Because you can't pick a fight unless you got something to fight with. Mm-hmm. And what comes to mind is I was sitting at a table, and this was a brick tutor. It was in Brookline, Mass. And I'm with a real prominent builder in the area. And the homeowner, we're talking about the remodeling, and the husband's like, yeah, we want to replace these 3 windows too. But he said it in such a way that all you builders out there will appreciate, that he just assumed those 3 windows were going to get rolled into the price and the price wouldn't change, right? That, I'm paying $400,000 for this remodeling job. You can just replace those 3 windows. Mm-hmm. And the builder's like, he looked at him and said, yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. We're probably, about $3,000 a window. And the homeowner goes, oh, that's another $12K added to that. And he goes, yeah. He goes, I got to pull those windows out. I got to dispose of them. We got to get the new windows. I got to install them. But installing them means that I have to integrate them properly with the weather resistive barrier and flashing. I have to trim them out on the inside. We have to get them painted on the inside and paint all the associative trim, patch any drywall, any of that stuff on the inside. And, by the time we're done, he goes, I think that $3,000 is probably a pretty fair number per window unit. And the homeowner goes,
three sounds cheap, by the way.
He goes, well, is there any way where we can sharpen our pencil on that? And the builder's answer was classic. He said, well, I could check with the lumber yard, and if I can get those windows at a discount, I'll pass that discount on to you. Right? But it was just, but that's how homeowners think. Some don't care so much about performance, or it's not that they don't care. It's that they don't understand. They think, oh, pop a few nails, pull that window out, nail a new window up. We're done, right? New windows in. How hard can that be? No, there's a lot to doing it right. And that, when it comes to new construction, people always say, well, you use a lot of triple glazed windows in European windows. It's like, how do your, clients, do they come to you with that knowledge? And I'm like, half my clients don't even know triple glazed windows exist.
Yeah.
But when you have the conversation with them about the health, the comfort, and then the energy efficiency and durability of that situation, then they say, well, why wouldn't I go that route? Right? And, I think, Jake, you brought it up earlier. When you link windows as part of your HVAC package, right? This was pretty enlightening on the Dan Roy house. We had our final window package there for the triple glazed windows was about $52,000, which for a 2,600 square foot house, that's a little on the high side, certainly. Right.
But you also have big windows too.
And we have big windows. But the other thing to keep in mind was, in putting the good windows in, it allowed us to put one mini split in that house because we drove the loads down so far. So $6,500, we had an HVAC system.
It's those dials, right? You dialed in.
It's those dials.
Yeah.
So let's take that for a second and switch to a domestic, a nice domestic brand, and we had it priced out. It was about $31,000. It was just over 30. So $20,000 less. But guess what?
Yeah.
When we put those windows in, and then we put a traditional HVAC system in the house, the windows went down to 31, but the HVAC system went from the 6.5K to like 26.5K. So the bottom line is, if we couple both of those numbers together, we're spending, $58,000 or just right around $60,000.
Yeah.
The question is, which scenario do you want to live in?
Yeah.
That's it.
And the triple glazed with the mini split is a more comfortable, more efficient, just better performing all around home. And when you look at even like a larger house like my house, we have zoning that, like, if I was going to do 4 zones in the house that I'm in right now, which is effectively what we have with a traditional system, we would have $35,000-$40,000 in HVAC, and we have $17,000 instead.
Wow, what a great...
I know you guys want to wrap it up, but I do have one story to tell, because I don't even know if you guys know this. I learned it on my trip to Europe, Jake. But did you guys realize that European windows, they're noted for being triple glazed, right? Well, their triple glazed window was not born out of energy efficiency. Did you guys know that? It was born out of a health epidemic, right? When they started dealing with very energy efficient homes, they were insulating them and air sealing them so well that the windows, hence my dials, became the worst part of the house. And they started getting condensation, mold growth, and a lot of health problems. And so the European countries looked at the window manufacturers and said, you know what? You guys better figure this out because we got a problem and we're not going to stop building the way we're building. You need to figure out the window problem. And so they moved to triple glazed and they moved there to, elevate that surface temperature of the interior glass to put condensation at a much lower risk and get rid of the health problem.
So, man, you just laid it right out for me, Steve, because now I can say, oh, they were managing moisture and energy with equal intensity.
I'm not even saying anything.
Any
more
chance
after that.
Peter can repeat his motto out loud for anybody to
It's
listen?
mantra.
He'll take
It's
it.
mantra.
It's my
Sorry.
mantra. Yes, little
It's a
grasshopper.
mantra.
Thank you very much.
I think he wrote that in when he was in the parsonage.
So, hey, if you've liked this episode, you definitely have to come back for the second episode of Windows because now to get all those linkages to performance, we are going to have to talk about the technical details. And I just can't wait because there's a whole lot of stuff we can talk about when we talk about the labels, the NFRC labels, and other aspects of Windows technologies, including what's on the horizon in terms of window performance.
Riveting.
So thanks, Jake and Steve. We're going to wrap up this episode of the Unbuild It podcast, and we hope to see you the next time we talk about Windows.
And Peter never remembers to say, please, if you have questions, you can email us, questions at theunbuilditpodcast.com or questions at unbuilditpodcast.com, and subscribe. And please go on iTunes and leave a 5-star review. By being a subscriber, it lets us know how many listeners we have on every episode. And by leaving a 5-star review, it makes Steve feel really good and continue to do this with Peter and I. So thank you. Thank you, Peter. Good job hosting. Thank you, Steve. Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, you guys.
Great day, guys.